why don't we go to an old, I don't know, not nemesis, sparring partner of the show.
Sparring partner.
Long-time caller, Otangelo in Brazil. Otangelo, what do you got for us today?
Yes, hello guys. Yes,
Hey,
hello,
Otangelo.
I'm aware. Hi, Vino.
Hello.
So yes, I saw your show on Talk Heathen with Katie. There was a caller who called in and talked about the origin of information contained in DNA. And your answer was basically that the DNA is just a chemical, it's just chemical reactions, it's just a chemical molecule, right?
Yeah, from a physical perspective, yeah.
Okay, but the caller, he was calling in wanting to talk about the information contained in DNA. And that would be evidence of God, which would be the injector of that information. And then that call went a little bit astray, so maybe we can come back to that topic, which I think is a topic which has been much debated between theists and atheists. It is a very interesting.
What do you think, Otangelo?
Well, I think that instructional assembly information like a blueprint or an AutoCAD drawing, which instructs to make a machine or a factory or a computer or a turbine or a neuron or whatever, requires intelligence. So that is basically my conclusion. That's what we precisely see in DNA, where we have information stored to make these things on a molecular scale. And I would like to know how you see this.
So, Otangelo, this is sort of this is tricky because when we look at seemingly precisely sequenced things, we generally try to attribute some intelligence to that, right? Like when we say the word information, we invoke like a representation or a representation of somebody giving that information and somebody receiving that information. But you can use physical examples to sort of draw conclusions on how something like DNA could exist without having somebody perpetrate it. For instance, if you look at the sequence of the planets in the solar system, a meteor passing through that will follow a certain path, presuming it enters at a certain place every time, right? Because those planets, if arranged identically, convey some path of the gravitational field. The same thing happens in chemicals. DNA is one of them, but even simpler chemical reactions, their structure, their atomic arrangement, everything, it dictates the speed of the chemical reaction. It dictates how much of a product comes through, how quickly it degenerates, all of those things. And that could be also seen as information, but we don't necessarily need to attribute, some character, some agent behind that information. We simply need to understand that some things are physical and some things that are physical lead to distinct and predictable outcomes.
Right. Yeah. So I think the biggest issue that I take is that when you call DNA information, you're smuggling in the assumption, like Vino suggested, that there is someone creating that information. And I don't think that that's warranted. So I think that one way, I think it says a lot about how we as scientists and humans understand DNA. We interpret it as information, as a code. We break it down into genes that, each do individual things. But it's really a working backwards situation, right? If you were just to look at a strand of DNA out of context, you wouldn't be able to tell where one gene ended and another one began, right? We only get that because of the way the body processes things. And so I think the issue with calling DNA information is because you're smuggling in those assumptions when I don't think they're warranted. And so if you're trying to use DNA to prove the existence of an information giver, I think you've put the cart before the horse.
Okay, DNA is actually a semantophoretic molecule, which is like the hardware but the sequence of nucleotides, those are the ones which is the actual information. So that sequence dictates the making of proteins, for example, or how to operate the cell. And that sequence
would you call it information, Otangelo? Would you call it information if there were no humans?
What? I don't understand your question. What do you mean?
No humans to interpret the idea. Like if we couldn't study DNA and it was just a molecule floating around or just by amoebas, then we wouldn't obviously refer to it as information, right? It was just physical happenstance.
Well, the thing is that, what science has discovered since the 50s from the last century, that DNA is a molecule which stores a very specific sequence of nucleotides. And that sequence dictates the sequence of polymer amino acids. And that sequence is actually which then confers the 3D form of proteins.
Yeah,
and that
we know how biology works.
A very specific. Okay, so that sequence is specified and complex in the sense that you cannot put any sequence into an amino acid chain and then have the right folding and a functional protein. So in sequence space...
Otangelo, if I take a deck of cards and I shuffle it, the sequence of cards is very specific. Very specific and it's unique, right? Does that mean that is information in the same context?
No, because what you actually need is a specific sequence which then bears function. You cannot have just any kind of sequence of amino acids and then have a functional protein. You need a very specific sequence in order to have...
I kind of agree with you, but the difference is that you don't actually need it to be that specific. You need it to be specific to a certain degree, but what we see throughout evolutionary biology, through biology, even if you take the evolution part out of it, is that everything in biology is just sort of good enough. You know, it's not optimized. It doesn't work the best. We humans only function, like our enzymes are only functional in a very narrow range of temperatures, which is why if you go below like 35 degrees core body temperature or above like 40 degrees Celsius, this is core body temperature, then you're in real trouble, right? And that's a really narrow thing. And that's because our enzymes that run our metabolic processes don't really function that well. They're not optimized.
Our eyes are a disaster. Our birthing process is basically unacceptable.
Yep. We have like I regularly take out organs that people are born with and regularly try to kill them just because they felt inflammatory that day. Like we're really not optimized. And so the trend in biology is that everything is just good enough. And that's what evolution sort of gets you, is it gets you to be just good enough to live long enough to pass on that gene and not any better, right? And we can even find examples of where if we go down to the molecular level, like you're talking about, where this folding is not perfect, it's not normal, but it's good enough, right? If you look at the thalassemias, you can be a heterozygote for like a thalassemia, and your blood's ability to carry oxygen is compromised. It's not normal because the folding of your hemoglobin molecules is abnormal, but it's functional. It's good enough, and people get by with it, right? So I don't think it's reasonable to say that this is, this DNA ordering is so precise, because it's really, you can get away with a lot. Vino, anything to add?
I mean, I think really this comes down to Otangelo, like you're attributing obviously a lot of importance to the order, and I think that where the major disagreement comes from here is the origin of that order. Not to be glib, but are you familiar with evolution? It is the process by which these pieces of information are refined, right? Like we have very, very clear, very well supported ways for this information to come about by natural means, right? You obviously have to take exception to that,
you are talking about information, but we have to start right from the beginning. And you need to have also a minimal sized information to have the first living and self-replicating and a free living cell. And we have a
sure, but you're going beyond the purview of evolution, remember? So evolution is about how one thing, or moving from one set of genetic material into another set of genetic material, right? Changes in allele frequency in populations over time. Classically, the origin of species, not the origin of life, the origin of species. It's about the diversification and the change over time. If you're talking about abiogenesis, then that's another issue. And unfortunately, I think that is something that we can never scientifically know for sure, because it's almost more of a historical question than it is a scientific question, right? But we can hypothesize about different ways that it could have happened, but I don't think we could ever know for sure, right, Vino? What do you think?
It won't happen again on Earth as it stands, right? Unless we make it, right? The Earth in which life formed is not the Earth we have today, right. And the conditions we have are not for the conditions we have today. So we aren't going to be able to easily replicate that. But you're saying we need a minimum amount of information. There are very simple self-replicating molecules which can be, obviously put into some area where they're protected or at least somewhat protected and get enough going that the processes of evolution can start on those self-replicating molecules. Correct me if I'm wrong, ribozymes, are those not self-replicating RNA molecules?
Yeah, ribozymes, yeah.
Ribozymes, yeah.
Yep. So, if you want to go to proteins, you can make the argument that prion diseases are examples of self-replicating proteins. But they've found molecules that are potentially self-replicating in the tails of comets, right? These molecules form under not uncommon circumstances, and they're all over the place. Earth is not as special as we think it is. It just so happens that Earth was sort of in the right place at the right time to enable those first, at least we think, self-replicating molecules to gain a foothold and ultimately evolve. And so that's the origin of the, we know very well the origin of the diversity that we see in genetic information, genetic material. But what we don't, and we can't, I think, ever know for sure is how it all started. Again, like Vino said, we can hypothesize, we can postulate, and we can test out how we think it might have happened, but we can never know for sure because, again, it's a historical question.
Okay, so what is the function of the genetic code?
To self-replicate.
Yeah.
No. The function of the genetic code is an assignment of 64 codons to 20 amino acids, and it is required in translation through the ribosome, okay? And you have 64 codon words, which are three nucleotides which are assigned.
But Otangelo, you're imparting these properties onto them, right? You're calling them words. There's nothing in DNA that says that it is that those codons are words or anything like that, right? The function of DNA is what it does, right? And what it does is DNA is transcribed into RNA in humans. It's then translated into proteins, which then carry out a function. And some of that function is to self-replicate, and some of it is to build different types of cells. You can't attribute any knowledge or something like or sentience to just function.
Well, the thing
function of
is
a fire
that
truck.
these are actually each codon is a word, is a genetic word, and it has a meaning because it is assigned to an amino acid, and that assignment has
It's not
explained.
assigned in the
And
way
this
that
is-
you are. It's not assigned in the way that you're implying, right? It's assigned in that the chemical interaction it corresponds to a particular amino acid. But as you may know, like different codons can code for the same amino acid and vice versa.
Does a meteor entering the atmosphere, is that assigned to fall to Earth, or is it just what's going to happen, right? You're attributing so much more meaning than there has to be.
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to, I think, to a certain degree, Occam's razor, right? If you don't need to multiply entities beyond necessity, and we don't need to invoke a being to have DNA follow physical processes, right? Do you agree, Otangelo, that DNA follows physical processes?
Yes, it follows physical processes, and you guys are.
So then why don't we just stop
when I'm
there?
talking.
Why don't we just stop there? Because we can't say, you can't be sure.
I am
that-
unable.
that the-
I'm unable sentence, and you guys cut me off and put me on mute.
Go ahead.
It's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation when this happens.
Go ahead, Otangelo.
I have not 1 minute to talk, and then you talk for 10 minutes. So it is very difficult to have an honest conversation.
Go ahead, Otangelo.
Okay. So you have a redundancy there, and that confers robustness to the genetic code. And the genetic code is 1 in a million. It is more robust than 1 million alternative codes. And yes, you have assignment of meaning. And we only know of intelligence which is capable of doing that, which is capable of assigning meaning to a word. And that is precisely.
Okay, I think I found the error in your argument there, Otangelo. You said we only know of intelligence doing this, right? And that is basically the definition of an argument from incredulity or an argument from ignorance, right? In your opinion, you don't believe that anything but an intelligence could do this, and we don't believe that, right?
I can think of at least one example.
Yeah. And like both Vino and I have worked in biology labs. I specifically, at one point, worked in a plant genetics lab where I was looking at the evolutionary biology of certain plants. And so I've seen firsthand how these things happen. And so, like, I think really that's what it comes down to. I'm really glad you called in, Otangelo. Unfortunately, I think we should keep moving. And so I'm going to say goodbye to you. But thanks for calling in. I really did appreciate it. What did you think, Vino?
Yeah, I mean, I always love listening to Otangelo, and I've recently found out I love talking to him as well. It brings me back to as you know, we have publicly debated abiogenesis and evolution and whatnot, and really harkens back to the good old days of the science versus less than science.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. It is interesting. I can see where he comes from, right? I can understand the idea of feeling like it's too perfect to be an accident. But of course, we don't see all of the entities, all of the simple self-replicating molecules on all the different Earths out there that never got to observe themselves, right?
Because or even the ones on our Earth that could have been but didn't make the evolutionary cut.
I mean, as Otangelo has previously pointed out in other calls, there were many amino acids that did not make the cut, and those species will never exist. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And I mean, obviously, when you're thinking about it, you can think about how interesting it is, how complex it feels. But unless you have the full picture in your head, you're really just you're just being poetic about it. Truth doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And Otangelo, I'm always happy to take your call. So if I'm ever hosting, you can always call in.